So let's continue. We're now in Chapter 8, Wars, Means, and the Importance of Fighting Well, in Walzer's work here. And Part 3, the War Convention, WCS War Convention. So we've seen this legalist paradigm plus the modifications dealt with jus ad bellum, the justice for war. Now the War Convention is going to dig into the other half of that distinction that Walzer made earlier. The War Convention deals with jus in bello, and more precisely, the duties with respect to the conduct of hostilities. So what are the duties of soldiers and states, generals, etc., etc.? So now the hostilities have broken out or have started or whatever. So we are now going to abstract in our judgments about fighting. We abstract means to move away from a certain thing. What's that thing? We abstract from the justice of the cause. So that is back here, the jus ad bellum, the justice of the cause and the reasons why the war and the morality of why the war started. That we abstract from, and we are only looking at the judgments about fighting. So not why or what necessarily causes the fighting or the morality of that, but we're just looking at the fighting now. So war as an activity really has no equivalent in society, right? Well, after all, we can and we do. Remember, Walzer is always talking about what we in fact do, what we in fact say. We do talk about rules of war, but there are no rules of robbery or other domestic crimes that you can rob well. And no, there's nothing like that. I mean, we talk about rules of how you can fight justly, right? That's what we're going to talk about. What does that mean? But there's no talk of, how you can rob justly. So that breaks down. And so we want to talk now about how to fight justly, again, abstracting from the justice of the cause, as Walzer says, right? So that makes, of course, the opposing sides in terms of their soldiers, those are morally equivalent, right? And Walzer, hammers this home repeatedly. They're morally equivalent, and we abstract from the reasons or whatever for the outbreak of the war. Okay, so he looks in a couple of sections. This is a very rich and interesting discussion because it's probably one of the most philosophical sections, but let's look at it from this angle. So utility and proportionality. He talks about the argument of Henry Sidgwick, who was a great 19th century utilitarian thinker, right? So utilitarianism has a long tradition, and Walzer basically says, if you lay out Sidgwick's principles 1 and 2, I'll talk about them in a second, and you interpret them in a utilitarian framework, you're going to get something that's intrinsically unsatisfying. So what does he mean? Well, the two principles go something like this. You're not allowed to do a Q, right, or Q standing for an act of force or some kind of military move. No Q such that Q doesn't contribute to victory. So that rules out, on warfare, you can't use force or whatever in ways unless they contribute to victory. Now, the problem with that is it needs another rider. In other words, to rule out sort of wanton violence, right? If you can't do something, that doesn't mean you can do absolutely anything you want that contributes to victory. So the second one is a proportionality notion that if Q that you're doing, some act of force, does contribute to the victory, okay, so it meets that criteria, right? So it passes that. How much does it contribute? How much towards the victory, and how much damage results. So now you're weighing the contribution to victory and the damage caused by this Q. And the contribution to the victory has to be much, well, that should be the other way. It must be much, much, much greater than Q's harm. So now you can think, how do you weigh that, right? How do you balance those two off? But let's just say if you can kind of calculate, so many, in the utilitarian model, so many units of contribution to victory, and that's vastly larger than 20. I'm simplifying things just to make the point that the contribution to victory is like 20 units of contribution, and the amount of harm is like 5 units, then you would say, oh yes, Q overwhelmingly is a contributor, and that outweighs how much damage it causes or the harm. So this is a harm type of judgment. Harm judgments and proportionality ones, right, they're difficult to make. And Walzer's concern goes something like this. On the face of it, it looks okay. It seems to eliminate wanton violence, right? Things that don't contribute and things that cause too much harm. If you're like, oh, yeah, that'll contribute, but that causes a lot of harm, so we're not going to do that. Walzer's concern is something like this. If you adopt an understanding of these according to a utilitarian model, now, really, he just means kind of a calculus where, you're kind of looking at units of harm. He says that it's always going to be difficult to do that, especially on this one, because if, a general says, well, this was really important, yeah, it caused a lot of damage, but, it really was important. He thinks that with that, if it was extremely important to the victory, and everyone wants the victory and all that, this is going to be something that's going to be denigrated, and it's not going to stand up. We're going to end up kind of sliding on this. And we're going to, and any time that you make a harm sort of something that you can calculate, there would be ways to, well, it might look really bad, but if you look at in the long run, this victory or this Q that we did, yeah, it caused a lot of harm, but you really have to look at it, the victory over the long run. So you could start expanding the other things, making the victory bigger, or thinking more about beefing this one up, or taking a different perspective. You can change how the harm looks, right? And so Walzer's point really, in the end, I mean, he's laying it out a little bit more technically than I'm doing here, but he's just worried that in the end, if you have a utilitarian kind of calculating model of understanding something like harm, you can always find some way to say, well, in the long run, that harm is bad, but it's sort of mitigated by all these other things we could talk about. And he says, that can be a real problem, right? Because in the end, we need some kind of objective, sort of non-utilitarian basis. In other words, we need, he doesn't use this term, but really he thinks we need kind of a deontological constraint where we say, no, look, there are just some kinds of things that are harms, that they're just, shock the conscience. You can't do that, no matter what. It's not even something that you can counterbalance, right? It's sort of a complete no-go kind of issue. And he talks about, wanton murder and rape in war. Those, you cannot put them in this kind of utilitarian type of calculus and say that, well, in some cases, we could come up with some way to override those kinds of acts. This is when we're thinking about plain and simply stuff that we're going to call an atrocity. This is absolutely unacceptable, no matter how it plays or contributes or whatever. There's just no way that this can be done. So that is raising the notion of a deontological constraint, and the path to that deontological constraint really is through human rights. And that's why Walzer says we really need to think of war not in a utilitarian type framework, but more of a human rights framework. He doesn't spell all this out right away, but he starts to bring this in now. So he says, look, a legitimate act of war does not violate the rights, the human rights of the people that are subjected to that act of war. So no rights violations in war. So that's something that's a harm that's not allowed at all, flatly. Now, what would those be? Well, again, it goes back to notions of total violations, like violations of the person. So the notion of, and you find this in the Human Rights Declaration, UDHR of the United Nations, right? The rights of the person, the dignity of the individual, that cannot be something that's harm. Rape would be an example of that. So these human rights that's the way we should understand 1 and 2 in that sense. So that puts a stronger constraint on Sidgwich's principles than sort of a utilitarian calculus, because Walzer thinks that while the utilitarian calculus, yeah, that's good, it does some great things, it does rule out a lot of wanton violence, but as he says also, it's not really sufficient to characterize this war convention. Remember, war convention, what we've been saying and talking about as, in society for generations, it doesn't seem to cover it. This is sometimes that there are certain things that we would just say, no, this is beyond what we will accept in any way. We're not even going to argue about it or say, is it possible to deal with it in any way? No, it's an absolute no-go zone. So the human rights, that's going to underpin the discussion, and he thinks that's what we need in order to ultimately make sense of war in an ethical way, right, to do our just war theory, and especially about talking about judgments that abstract from this. We're going to have to be talking about human rights in the context of the actual, the battle space or the military theater, or whatever you want to call it. So the human rights apply to soldiers and civilians. So he introduces this crucial distinction. These can, in a sense, be used in war. Soldiers, they do forfeit certain things about the right not to be killed, right? They're in battle. It's not murder if in certain ways, if you soldiers kill each other. We don't call that murder. It's killing in war, but it's not going to be murder because certain human rights are lifted or changed, at least for this group, but not for this one. All right. So civilians are really, there's like soldiers are, as Walzer quotes Napoleon, they're kind of made to be killed, which is a horrific expression. But that gets the idea across that they can be legitimately killed in war, but civilians cannot. They cannot be used in any way in war. That's your deontological constraint specifically, but overall, a human rights framework is the way we're going to start understanding this. And as Walzer says, that what he wants to do is to talk about this crucial distinction. And he thinks that ultimately underlying all of this, right, even the moral equivalency of soldiers, how important that is, but at a deeper level, human rights throughout the theater of war, those things have to be respected. And so that's what he wants to start unpacking, as he says, in the next few chapters in what he has called the War Convention. See you next video.